Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am joined by Emma, a good friend of mine that I got to meet about a year ago. She's another guest from that famous coaching program that I did, that I came out of meeting all these incredible women. So welcome, Emma. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Francesca. This is such an honor to get to be on your podcast. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. I'm just going to share a little bit about who you are and why I was like, I feel like this would be a good conversation for our community. So, Emma's a trauma therapist who works with thoughtful feminist women and disconnected couples in Colorado and Florida. She uses therapeutic approaches like EMDR and internal family systems, which I think we will get into. And she helps clients get out of their heads and into their bodies so they can finally heal the deep wounds. Beautiful. I always like to just get started with like what brought you to this work?
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine like all of us, it's kind of a complicated answer or a long answer, I guess,
Hmm.
so I mean, essentially I came from a childhood that was not perfect or ideal. My parents split up when I was young, and there was just, a lot of kind of chaos and, abuse in my family, neglect, stuff like that,
Hmm.
which was, very challenging for me as a kid. Both my parents remarried, and that was challenging as well with like new
Hmm.
partners that didn't really get along with. I had a lot of like mental health issues as a kid. I was very, very anxious, as well as really depressed and suicidal as I kind of got into my like 12-year-old past phase.
Hmm.
Um, the beautiful thing was my dad, despite, of course, we all have our issues, despite all that, he was a safe person for me. And he took me to see my first therapist when I was well, I think I saw one when I was 5. I didn't love her, but I saw one that I actually really connected with when I was around 12. She actually helped me get on antidepressants, which at the time were very useful for me. But she was also just an incredibly safe, comforting person who really, I felt like, got me and understood me. And she was kind of the only person in my life I really felt that, I had that with.
Yeah.
And so I really, I thought it was one of the most impactful, meaningful things I'd experienced in my life. I saw her
Hmm.
from when I was 12 up until I really graduated from high school. And
Hmm.
then after that, I continued to see therapists like throughout my life, and just felt like I grew so much and learned so much about myself. I was always so interested in like inner work and inner healing. I went off to get a PhD in philosophy, actually. And so
Wow.
yeah, I mean, I've always really been interested in our mind and mindfulness and who we are as people, and like, yeah, so much to say about all this stuff. But
Yeah.
essentially, I continued seeing a therapist throughout that journey. I had a big life change where I had, essentially a divorce from a partner I'd been with for like 10 years around a time I was in grad school for philosophy. And I decided to kind of leave philosophy, leave that world, and go pursue counseling. And I moved cities. I kind of started brand new. Yeah, and I started this career. It was something that it was always kind of like in the back of my mind, like, ooh, this would be so great. Like I'm a
Hmm.
little jealous of the therapist in all these interactions that gets to like sit here in her office, this beautiful space, and like be this person. So I was very
Yeah.
excited to do it, and went through a lot of challenging jobs and things on my way to where I am now, which is I've been in private practice for um, around 10 years now, which is
Mm.
lovely. And yeah, so it's really the most fulfilling career I could ever imagine having. I feel
Yeah.
so blessed that I get to talk to amazing women and couples every single day, that
Hmm.
and to help people for a
Hmm.
living. So yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind
No,
of,
that makes a
yeah.
lot of sense. Thank you for sharing all that and also kind of like what you've been through and the beauty of finally being able to be in a space or sit with a person, have like such a restorative, I guess, relationship with someone that allows you to probably even see yourself in a better light than maybe you were originally seeing yourself or even the people around you. It totally, there's something so magical about therapy, that it's like, how just sitting with this person talking about these things now, like my whole life and way of viewing things is just completely shifted.
Yeah. You see yourself in a completely different way. And I think you have compassion for yourself when you're seeing
Yeah.
yourself sort of like reflected back in someone
Yeah.
else. So, yeah, it's so
100%.
powerful. And just to have, I mean, I think as a society, like we undervalue like quote unquote women's work, but like,
Mhm.
excuse me, like the power of having someone compassionately be with you and sit with you. Like there's nothing like that. I think they call it survival of the nurtured for a reason, you know?
Survival of the nurturer.
Mm.
What
Yeah, I
exactly?
think that's something I first heard it from Tara Brach. If you are you
Mm,
familiar with
yeah.
her?
Yeah. She's like radical compassion. Is that her
Radical
word?
acceptance.
Radical
Yeah.
acceptance. Okay. Yeah.
She does have a book called Radical Self-Compassion as well,
Yeah.
but she talks about it that it's not actually, and I think it's someone else originally, I can't remember. But it's not actually survival of the fittest, it's survival of the nurtured. And I do
Mm,
believe that's true. Like the more, we're able to helpfully attach and be loved and be seen, the more able we are to express our gifts or, you know, yeah, to move out of trauma and into a more expansive existence. So,
yeah. Yeah, that
yeah.
makes a lot of sense because trauma, it like completely blocks your ability to like healthily, that's not a word, but whatever. But like healthily attached to others in your life
Yeah.
um and it also just blocks so many of the natural talents or gifts that we have because we're so consumed either thinking about the trauma or protecting ourselves from it happening again or living it in a different dynamic with a different person, but somehow living in the same situation that we had, for example, grown up in, if we
Yeah.
haven't like processed it. So it can be so incredibly debilitating and time consuming if you haven't been able to work through it.
Yeah, yeah, we tend to continue to get triggered because, the way our mind works is we start to, like, if we've experienced a trauma, we start to, like, and there are things that our mind associates with that trauma and reminds us of the trauma. We start
Yeah.
to become triggered by those things and continue to, like, to feel traumatized over and over and over again because it just
Hmm.
keeps kind of expanding what our minds associate with trauma
Yeah. Yeah.
until we work on really healing all
Hmm.
those, that trauma and the root of it. Yeah.
Right, right, right. So I'm curious now that I have a lovely trauma therapist in front of me, I'll ask you some of the questions that I'm like, just intellectually nerding out here. But a lot of times in trauma, healing or therapy, they talk about how like when the trauma happens, it's like the dials in our brain kind of get like messed up a little bit. So we maybe overreact to certain things or we underreact to certain things that we probably should be reacting to more intensely. Can you walk us through like why it is that that happens and what exactly that means for
Mm.
trauma survivors?
Yeah, 100%. I mean that absolutely happens. So, with in terms of like what you said, the dials being kind of messed up, like a big part of some of the symptoms of having PTSD are like being hyper reactive. And so kind of constantly being a little bit on edge. And I noticed this in myself for a lot of my life, like being kind of easily startled, jumpy, always feeling this like anxiety or fear or worry. sometimes it can look like this like intense like overthinking or planning or,
Mm,
this feeling
mhm,
of adrenaline in your body, just like your heart racing, like things like that. And I think I probably lived in that state for a lot of my life. I think my clients also live in that state. And so this is really common because your body, in response to a trauma, it goes into the state of like hyper arousal to try and protect you. So, like we talked about, how we come to see a lot of things as threats when we have a trauma, when our body sees all that, like a lot of stuff in our environment as potential threats, which of course we also naturally do this because we're human and that's what's helped us survive for so long. But when we're traumatized, we see even more stuff as potentially threatening. And so this is happening very frequently that, we're feeling on edge, we're feeling, like we have to be on our toes or the other shoe is going to drop. I
mhm.
can't tell you how many of my clients or how much I hear that phrase in my practice, like
Yeah,
the other shoe
yeah,
may drop.
yeah.
And so, yeah, we're constantly like trying to protect, and it's a very adaptive, healthy skill to be able to
Mhm,
protect against danger happening.
mhm,
But the problem is that these things that our body is seeing as threats are usually not actually threatening. So,
mhm,
public speaking or something like that is not threatening in the way that, not being able to have a meal when you were a kid or,
mhm,
being bullied or something like that was actually threatening to you.
mhm,
So that's sort of like the hyper arousal side. Another thing that can happen, and you kind of mentioned the dial being like turned down and that we don't sometimes respond to things as much, is that when this can often happen if we've been in a period of like hyper arousal for a while, but our body becomes pretty much like burnt out and kind of like just shuts down. And so we go into like a state of like hypoarousal where we are kind of numb, sluggish, like we're not um, as quick to respond. And this is a very natural thing that happens to animals who are like overwhelmed with fear or who have been perpetually put in a state of like, trauma or abuse or something like that. So
mhm,
yeah, our bodies essentially just kind of shut down to protect us and almost like prepare for death in the body. I mean, that's not
mhm,
what we are thinking rationally, but that's like
mhm,
what's happening in our body, that our digestion will slow down, like everything in our bodies will essentially slow down. We might experience kind of a low level depression or malaise, not feeling excited about anything, feeling kind of numb. And yes, not really being able to do some of those tasks that, maybe filing our taxes is like the hardest thing in the world. And it's hard to just get off the couch and stop scrolling and take a shower. And of course, that
mhm.
happens to all of us in many ways from time to
Yeah,
time. But if we're
yeah,
really traumatized, that might be happening a lot.
yeah.
Yeah.
100%. I think it's super helpful. I mean, I find it helpful. I know like people that I've worked with as well is understanding how what happened to us impacts us at this like bodily level, right? Like subconscious body level. Because um as someone who has done a lot of work on herself to kind of recover from traumatic situations that happened in my teenage years, I know that growing up in an environment, I grew up in Italy, so growing up there, a lot of the narrative around mental health was stop whining, get up, like
Mm.
stop being anxious, like what is anxiety? Like you're just nervous, you need to just like calm down and like chill, like that kind of thing, right? Like, and so when I was really struggling with my mental health, it was really challenging to have compassion for myself because the narrative around mental health was not very supportive towards, right? Like what someone goes through and the hardships that they're experiencing. And so understanding how trauma works, the impact that it has on us, not just our thoughts, but literally it's like in our body, the fact that it's stored in our body can be so eye-opening and just like kind of lift that weight off of ourselves of, those, like you said, those days where the most basic things feel so impossible. Showering feels so challenging. All these things that like humans and adults should be able to do feels so difficult, almost impossible to reach. At that point, it's like, okay, wait, maybe I'm not like I hate like I always tell my clients, I'm like, lazy does not exist. Like, let's just get rid of that like day one. Like, please, let's
Yeah.
just like not, you know. But getting rid of those like judgmental labels of ourselves to understand what's happening internally. And
Mhm.
then, I mean, obviously, with that kind of awareness, you can then do something about it. You can try and figure out like, resources that you can use to help yourself, support yourself, I guess, in those moments like that, those things are harder to do is like break down the task or get someone to help you, all those things that we can do. But you can
Yeah.
only do that once you understand what's actually going on and you've taken the blame off of like yourself and just your, I don't know, inherent inability to be a capable, productive member of society.
Yes, yes, I love that you mentioned this. And by the way, it's so cool that you grew up in Italy, but I'm sure it came with its own,
Came with its own, but
issues
it was
and
very cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what part were
Yeah.
you in, by the
I was
way?
in Milan in the north.
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I mean, what you say about like, kind of the cultural narrative around like
Hmm.
you're, just suck it up, blah, blah, blah. I feel like
Hmm.
it's so common in a lot of different cultures. And I
Hmm.
also see it, in US clients as well with, I mean, I work with a lot of women and myself included who I call highly sensitive.
Hmm.
And I think probably many people are sensitive, but it kind
Hmm.
of gets like bred out of us.
Hmm.
Where, especially as kids, like things affect us. Like maybe, we're sensitive to violence, loud noises, smells, like, but we also really perceive beauty in a lot of things, or, like all of these qualities that I think, again, like if we were very in touch with it, probably many more people might identify in this way. But a lot of people got told as a kid, like, you're too sensitive, you're too soft, you're fragile, suck it up, you need to be tougher in some way, or like, that's not a big deal. Like, that thing that happened to you is not a big deal. There are other people who have it way worse and, who are really suffering. At least you have food on the table or clothes on your back or whatever.
Hmm.
And so that
Hmm.
message I find is really deeply ingrained. And you kind of mentioned this in a lot of
Hmm.
like my clients' heads of like,
Hmm.
well, I feel guilty for feeling bad about this because so many people have it so much worse than me. Or,
Hmm.
it was just a little bit of bullying I experienced at school. Like it's not that
Hmm.
big of a deal,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
it wasn't full on rape. It was,
Hmm.
assaultive behavior and people
Hmm.
have it way worse.
Hmm.
So that is, a protective mechanism that we have developed and that like that minimizing of our own pain that probably
Yeah.
allowed us to survive and fit in and, feel like a productive
Yeah.
member of society.
Yeah.
And that what I like to do with clients is like work on like understanding how and why that developed and if that part needs to work as hard now as it has
Hmm.
been.
Hmm.
And really, letting letting that part feel comfortable, sort of relaxing back so we can
Hmm.
work on like feeling some of the grief and some of the pain that maybe got exiled
Yeah.
at a young
Yeah.
age. Yeah.
I'm curious in the work that you do because this all sounds like so beautiful and like I'm so on board. And one of the things that honestly I'm struggling with right now, and I'm sure a lot of people do as well, is that living in a society that doesn't really favor like taking a break so that we can do grief work, right? Like we have bills to pay, we have work to do, we have things we need to accomplish and get done. And like the matrix that I'm struggling with right now personally, I know I built it myself, so I'm trying to like unbuild it.
Yeah.
But but I think you know what I mean by that. But
Yeah.
the at the end of the day, like as much as I can unbuild my own matrix, do still live in a society where there are certain expectations of how you're supposed to like perform as a human, or even as a kid, if you go through certain things, you're still supposed to get up, go to school, do what you need to do, get shit done. And I think we've lost in our culture and community. Like now moving to Canada, I'm learning a lot more about Indigenous communities and some of the
Mm.
practices that they had and like the celebrations that they have and the circles that they have and the spaces that they have created in order to gather as a collective and heal and process and feel, right? Like all these things that are so vital to our healing and our well-being, but it goes against like this like very like patriarchal capitalistic society that we live in. So how do you help people navigate the balance between those two, I guess?
Oh my God, good question. If I knew had that, if I had the answer, I would be like a Nobel Prize winner. But um, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is so true. It reminds me of like, in a lot of European cultures and other types of cultures, like the when someone
Yeah.
dies, like throwing dirt on the grave and wailing and, you know,
Mm.
feeling viscerally our grief and how in France, for example, like grief, like there isn't the same negative association with like sadness and depression and grief
Mm.
as there is in the United States. And there's
Interesting.
also in many cultures, like people have far more time off. Like,
Yeah.
first of all, just during the day to like, it's not like every minute needs to be optimized and needs to be
Yeah.
productive, but also like, during the year, like there's all this time off.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is something we were talking about before we kind of started recording is like in our
Hmm.
culture, how it's so fast paced and there is this
Hmm.
emphasis on always optimizing and getting the most out of every minute and
Yeah.
moving as fast as you can and the
Yeah.
competition and because we do live in this capitalist society. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that, of course, we're all working to balance in the best way we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I work with a lot of clients and, I've worked with this myself on how to slow down. Like a
Mm.
lot of times that like fast pace and feeling the need to move at 100 miles an hour can also
Mhm.
be like a trauma response that we feel this fear of like, if we stop moving, what's going to happen? Are we going to be safe? Are we going to be, will we be able to survive? Will we be able to pay our bills? And
Yeah.
if we're not advancing on some traditional ladder, what does that mean about us or say about
Mm.
us?
Hmm.
Does it mean we're in some way incompetent and we're not a part of the group or we're different, which is, I think,
Invaluable. Yeah.
invaluable? Yeah, not
Yeah.
valuable. I think it's the thing
Yeah.
that people fear really,
Yeah.
truly the most.
Right.
So doing some deep work on like if we are rushing like that, like where is that
Hmm.
coming from? Like what
Hmm.
what is the protective part of us that's, kind of doing that
Yeah.
and why and like really feeling into and examining why. And of course, there are seasons
Mm.
where movement and going for it are like, that's in line with what we want and our
Sure.
values and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And then there are a lot of times, I would say probably the majority of the time when it's probably hurting us more than it's
Hmm.
helping us.
Oh yeah, for
So
sure. For sure.
yeah. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I work with people to help them leave toxic jobs and, quit
Hmm.
things that are no longer serving them and find a lot more
Yeah.
fulfillment and maybe live simpler and stuff like that all the time. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I know it's not
And
a
you do,
perfect,
no,
yeah,
I love it. It's
answer,
no, no,
but
it's a perfect answer. It's a lot of the work I've been doing on myself. This is what I love about this podcast. I was like, oh, I get to interview all my therapist friends and then just like it's wonderful talking to therapists because you just kind of chat and then you get your own like sense of healing throughout, which is beautiful.
yeah.
But I no, I love that. I love your response because it's true, right? Like sometimes there's an acknowledgement of reality. There's an
Mhm.
acknowledgement of, even like in the trauma work, right? Like there's an acknowledgement that something was challenging. And there's an acknowledgement that there are certain situations where maybe it's what you're projecting onto the situation rather than what's actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah,
And I
a
think
hundred
that's really
percent.
powerful to recognize because that's when we then are able to find our own sense of agency, especially for trauma survivors, like not feeling like you're just trapped in this system or in this job or in this relationship, being able to believe that you actually have autonomy and agency and influence, power, influence over the type of life that you get to live.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I think that that is something for many of us growing up in the United States. Like, we have just seen, this fast pace all of our
Hmm.
lives, and then we're
Hmm.
inundated with it, like we see our parents working jobs, sometimes working like so hard. Probably our
Yeah.
grandparents did that, especially if they were coming from, another country to try and make it in the United States or
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
and just busting and busting to be able to like afford the American dream.
Yeah.
Um, and then like, all around us, we're inundated with these messages about productivity and how to climb the ladder. And, all of this, stuff is also thrown in our face, status symbols that we're supposed to want
Yeah.
to achieve and different milestones we're supposed to hit, which
Hmm.
become harder and harder to hit, with like
Hmm.
owning a home or whatever it is.
Hmm.
And, many of us, I think, don't stop and think about like what it is we truly want, like what is
Yeah.
actually in line with our like
Yeah.
our values and the life we want to live.
For sure.
And so I think that that is another benefit of therapy, is that it like causes you to kind of reflect on, is this what I want? I'm on this
Yeah.
hamster wheel and I'm moving at
Yeah.
this pace. And does
Yeah.
that pace really work for me and serve me?
Hmm.
Or do I want something different? And
Hmm.
yeah, my partner and I a few years ago kind of decided we wanted something different, and we
Hmm.
now spend a lot of our time in Mexico, and we live a slower pace of life here, and we live simply, and we have great friends, and we have a really nice life.
Hmm.
But it's not the traditional white picket fence kind of
Yeah.
life. And
Yeah.
we prioritize stuff like travel and experiences and time together. And we also don't work ourselves to the bone. So
Yeah.
it's definitely possible to do it
Hmm.
differently.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think so too. And I wonder, you probably saw this a lot, but like, I think that's why in some ways the pandemic was such a, for those who had the privilege of staying home and self-reflection, obviously, but either way, I think it was a really important time for a lot of people because they got to slow down and they had all this space, and all this space forced them to look at themselves and look at their life and decide, even like relationship wise, like, is this relationship really the relationship that I want to be in, or is it just the relationship that I happen to be in? And because I have a strong sense of duty, now I'm going to make sure that it continues living, but is it really what I want for the rest of my life? And just kind
Yeah.
of asking, and because it's easy when your life is so busy, you can distract yourself from all those questions. You can do the scrolling or go to work and do the things and participate in all the committees and everything. But when you really slow down, it's like, now I have to sit between me and my thoughts and, actually listen to these questions that are kind of like haunting me a little bit.
Yes, 100%. I think that was, part of why the pandemic, there was so much, of course, there can be such a thing as like overthinking things
Sure.
and kind of getting
Yeah.
lost in our own thoughts. And I do think that was part of why the pandemic, so many people were depressed. But I also saw after the pandemic that there was a lot of change. Like people
Hmm.
were, deciding to do things differently. People were moving to
Hmm.
other countries, leaving jobs
Hmm.
and relationships that
Hmm.
weren't serving them. And sometimes
Hmm.
in relationships, like also the pandemic, because it was, so much pressure on couples and you were really everything for one another,
Yeah.
which is not, how it often is in our normal
Not, yeah.
lives.
Yeah.
Like it, but it also brought out maybe some of the issues in relationships that people were having, that it was
Yeah.
harder to face if they were just kind of going to work and doing their own things, and then we're coming
For
together in the
sure.
evening or whatever.
For
So,
sure.
yeah, I think we can have more of that self-reflection, hopefully without needing to go into a pandemic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Switching gears just a little bit, I'm curious about the feminist lens and approach that you take to your work. If you can just like talk, super on board, just curious, like, talk to us
Yeah.
about that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. You know, this was something I was always super passionate about when I was in college. I studied women's and gender studies. I had a minor in it. And then as I was in philosophy, I was always, I was studied ethics and, with a feminist lens and stuff.
Mm.
And then as I, just have kind of moved into the world, when I did move into the world of counseling and everything, just something I've always been acutely aware of, I think, is how being, women, but also, feminism is broader than that. Like anyone
Yeah,
who is in a disempowered group,
yeah.
like how those things affect our mental health, affect our
Mhm.
relationships, affect our ability to meet and express our needs,
Yeah,
all of these things. And
yeah.
so, like, it's something that, I'm privileged, like I'm a white woman, but I'm a
Hmm.
woman, which, that is
Hmm.
also something that is a disempowered experience to be a woman in
Yeah,
this society. So,
yeah.
the way, what I really try and work on with clients is like understanding and like really understanding deeply the ways that living in a patriarchal system has
Hmm.
has contributed and set us up to feel some of these feelings of unworthiness and never
Hmm.
measuring up and perfectionism
Hmm.
that many of the people I know struggle with. Like these are white
Hmm.
patriarchal values
Yeah,
and they're
yeah.
designed to keep women and disempowered groups
Yeah.
small.
Hmm.
Because women become we often become like our own worst enemies. Like even if there
Yeah.
isn't someone directly oppressing us, we are
Yeah.
often oppressing ourselves, like trying to get
Yeah.
ourselves to fit and make, be physically smaller, be in a smaller body,
Hmm.
or overloading our schedule with tons and tons of
Hmm.
things, or being essentially the emotional laborer and caretaker for everyone in our families or
Yeah.
whatever it is, like,
Yeah.
being perfect at work, like being the perfect mom, earning enough money, all this stuff, like
Hmm.
it's too much for
Hmm.
any person to do, and no
Hmm.
one should have that kind of pressure on them. But we often put that pressure on ourselves. So, I mean, the first thing
Yeah.
is really about understanding the ways our society and being, in a disempowered group has led to that
Hmm.
experience, and
Hmm.
being able to untangle like what is my reality and my truth and my story from
Yeah.
what are the things that, have been kind of put upon me. And
Yeah.
I think that's the first step to developing like a compassionate relationship with ourselves,
100%. A
you
hundred
know?
percent. I remember
Yeah.
like the first few years into therapy, my therapist would be like, Francesca, like women in society, blah, blah, blah. And like I've always like considered myself a feminist. I've always like been on obviously um cared deeply, been very passionate, even like actively the way that I talk about these things. But I would be talking to him about like a personal problem and he would relate it back to like society. And I was like, what is this man talking about? Like, I'm telling you my personal problem and how I think about myself. And it took me a while there to understand the parallel between the way that I talk to myself and the society that I live in and how that shaped that very personal, intimate inner dialogue that I have has been, and for many people that, obviously you and I work with, has been very much like contaminated by this patriarchal expectations of women and how they're supposed to be. And, even like decisions that I make, sometimes I don't even realize that they're coming from this like idea that as a woman, I'm supposed to like sacrifice certain things so that whatever, work, family, everything, like just a lot of self-sacrifice and not understanding that this decision-making process, the belief that I should be doing that wasn't really born in me. It's something that we absorb throughout living in these cultures. And it's very liberating
Yes.
when you get to be like, oh, this was kind of imposed on me, right? The
Yeah.
conditioning. And like you were saying, of like staying small, even how small we keep our bodies, how much we restrict food or obsess about working out or calories and all those things. And there's this quote that I really loved. I think it's like Glennon Doyle. She, suffers with anorexia and bulimia and whatnot. And she talks about, she's like, the more time I spend thinking about my anorexia and my body, the more power I'm giving to the patriarchy. And she
Yes.
was like, I'm done thinking about, I mean, obviously it's a lot harder said than done, but she's like, I'm done. Like, because I'm just giving them more and more power, worrying about my wrinkles instead of worrying about how I can be of service to other people in my community.
Yes, yes, and it's interesting. Like everything you said just resonates so much, and
Yeah.
it's interesting, like how much, when we're spending all our time thinking about how to fit into these boxes and be perfect or shrink our bodies or be beautiful or be the super
Mhm.
mom or whatever it is,
Yeah.
I mean, that's time that we're not thinking about the ways where we've been oppressed and like how we want things to be different or
Yeah.
and that doesn't need to look any certain way, but it might even look like that means we're spending time thinking about how to free ourselves or our kids or
Mhm.
our families or how to stand up to someone in a relationship or something like that. It
Mhm.
might look like advocacy, it might look like helping our communities. When you were talking, I was thinking my partner and I were actually talking about this morning. Like there's this thing that happened to me once that was like such a kind of like picture of the way I have like internalized
Mhm.
patriarchal, assumptions within me, which was that I was running on a trail one time in Colorado where I lived for 15 years and still, go back to often.
Mhm.
And I like, there was a man in front of me on the path, and I was running towards him, and I like tripped over a rock and fell and kind of like, it was like a pretty big fall where I like hurt my knee or
Mhm.
whatever. And I just kind of like blocked the path for like an instant. And the first thing I said was, sorry, instead of
Mhm.
like, at
Mhm.
all tending to myself or whatever. But it was just this automatic response,
Yeah.
of like
Right.
I'm in the way, I'm taking up space,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
though I was like injured in that
Right.
moment. And
Right.
yeah,
Right. Like,
yeah,
how dare I take up space? I should have just like crawled off to the side immediately to
yeah,
make sure that you weren't like inconvenienced by like my fall.
yes,
Um,
yes,
by
exactly.
this like very accidental thing that actually might have injured me. But oh gosh, let me not even make this about me.
Yes,
Like,
totally.
even take up the space to be like, wait, I need my time to get up and move. But it's such a small, I love that you brought that up because it is such a like a small moment and incident, right? But it is very reflective of how we show up as women in society. Even
Yes.
I'm reading a lot about leadership, like for myself to kind of embody that and understand how to do that. And a lot of it is even simple things like when you show up to a meeting, if you're 2 minutes late, instead of saying like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," being like, "Thank you for your patience." Like, because it's such a
Mhm.
different, just in the way in which we position ourselves. One is like,
Mhm.
Please forgive me," you know. One is
Yeah, shrinking. Yeah.
shrinking,
Hmm.
exactly, making ourselves small. And the other one is like comfortably taking up space and acknowledging that these other people waited for us. But like,
Hmm.
did their lives end? Like, were they severely traumatized? No, they were just slightly uncomfortable and
Yeah.
inconvenienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can't protect people from being
Hmm.
inconvenienced or from being disappointed in our lives. And the
Yeah,
fact that someone is inconvenienced or disappointed isn't
yeah,
our responsibility or really our business. Like
yeah.
which I think is something that can make it really hard for people. Like boundaries can be so challenging
Yeah.
for us as women, I think, because of
Yeah.
this. Like, and I know this is like your forte, like this is your
Yes.
area that you're
I'm
such
like,
an
oh gosh, do
expert
we have
on.
another 40 minutes to chat about
Yeah.
boundaries and trauma? Because, yeah, that
Yeah.
opens like a whole other door. But I was similarly thinking, like going back to being, let's say for now, just like female identifying in society, if you've been through any sorts of trauma, it is very challenging to feel like you are deserving of taking up space after you fall and not apologizing or just setting
Mhm.
boundaries or things like that because it's been very internalized that it is our responsibility to, I don't even know if manage ourselves, but just directly manage the other person and make sure that they're okay and just like forget about whatever is going on with ourselves.
100%. Yes. Forget about ourselves. I mean, that's something that was, bred into us as women and, a lot of disempowered groups from a very, very young age. And I also think like the current political climate that we're
Yeah.
living in right now with
Yeah.
Trump, like that
Yeah.
contributes as well. Like
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's another aspect of, like I'm noticing a lot of people are coming and they're very triggered, understandably,
Yeah.
by everything
Yeah.
that's going on, but
Yeah.
it brings up all these feelings of I don't, I'm invisible, I don't matter, which literally is happening to
Yeah.
groups like being
Yeah.
being erased or being
Yeah.
told that they don't exist or don't
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah.
Um, so that is something like a lot of people's trauma symptoms are flaring a lot
Yeah.
right now because of all
Understandably.
of that.
Yeah.
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 Understandably. I think because I was thinking about that too, and I was like, at what point am I going to bring that up in this conversation? Because it's definitely a very pertinent, thing that's happening that's in our minds right now. And we're recording this now in February. This will probably come out in September, but just to give context to why you and I are bringing it up like that. And I think it really is challenging, especially when you're doing the work to recover from trauma, you're doing the work to feel safe in your body. It is very difficult to believe that you are safe in your body when the people in power have done things that are not safe and are not being held accountable. And so it just gives permission for other people who want to do unsafe things to go ahead and do those things.
Yeah.
And it is very challenging to feel safe in a society like that. And so it
Mhm.
makes sense that a lot of people are feeling traumatized, whether it's disempowered,
Mm,
other disempowered groups, whether it's women, intersectionality obviously plays a role. But it's like,
totally.
you go to your therapist, you're like, yeah, 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 I know I'm supposed to feel safe, but like, how? There's like,
Yeah.
these things are
Yeah.
happening again. Like women are losing their rights, transgender people are losing their rights.
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
look into politics as much as I probably should. I try and stay away from it as much as I can because I need to show up and do this work and not
Yeah.
fall into like, flaring up trauma symptoms or whatever. But yeah, it's pretty devastating for a lot of people. You can't tell them like you're reliving your trauma. It's just your trauma. It's like, no, there's a real situation happening. And so understandably people are freaking the F out. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, it's really challenging because, a huge part of working with trauma is like helping people understand, like helping our bodies understand, like
Hmm.
we are safe now.
Yeah.
And for a lot of groups and a lot of people, like we're not safe now,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
so, there are ways that we're safer, and there
Yeah.
are ways that
Yeah.
things aren't happening like at this moment,
Yeah.
potentially, hopefully, that are like harming us right now. And there are resources and options, probably some of us have that maybe we didn't
Yeah.
have access to before.
Yeah.
And it's more challenging, of course, at a time like this. So yeah,
Yeah.
so I just want to say that like to anyone, if you are, I mean, who knows what the world will be like in September, but if
Yeah.
you are experiencing that, it's not, it makes sense that you would be
Hmm.
experiencing this more right now and you would be
Hmm.
struggling more. And I just encourage you to like take care of yourself and like
Yeah.
seek support.
Yeah.
You're definitely
Yeah.
not alone in it too.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
agree. And I think I don't know if this is good, if this is like what should be done, but I do find that there's certain situations in which if we have the privilege to, is like sometimes you just need to turn off the news and like go outside and like touch grass and like be with community and like it's so far out of our control. And I think as trauma survivors, it can be really challenging to feel like you have control. And so I think it's important to not continue putting yourself in a situation where you're going to feel even more helpless and hopeless and powerless over a situation.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And, I think that there can be a balance too between like doing things that help you feel empowered and taking action that feels good and aligned,
Hmm.
and also allowing yourself to disconnect from the
Yeah.
constant barrage of news and the attention grabbing headlines that this administration is like feeding off of.
Yeah.
That it's important to be able to like your mental health matters, and part of the way this administration stays stays strong is by
Hmm.
wreaking havoc on the mental health of the people who are opposing it. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, you part of the way you can resist is actually by taking care of yourself. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. That's a beautiful final message because I don't want to wrap like a perfect bow on it and say like, Emma, what piece of advice do you have for people listening? Because I feel like that would just trivialize the whole conversation we just had. But I think that is a really beautiful message, like genuinely. And I think even looking into if you haven't checked this out, for those listening, but I think her name is Trisha. I forget her last name now, but she wrote Rest is Resistance, and it's
Mm,
really powerful. And I think that would be a great first place to start of just
mm,
like believing that taking care of yourself actually might be the best thing that you can do right now so that you can show up for the people in your life that you may need to show up for.
mhm. Yeah, and showing up for yourself as well,
Yeah,
like that
yeah.
you do matter, your needs matter. You were told in so many ways for most of
Hmm.
your life probably that your needs didn't matter, but
Hmm.
now you have the opportunity to treat yourself with the love and kindness and compassion you would treat your own child with.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah,
And I think
yeah.
if you aren't able to do that, go work with people like Emma who can help you, you know, go
Or
find,
you. Yeah.
yeah, find
Yeah.
therapy, find support, coaching, whatever it is. I think sometimes we get a little nitty gritty on what professional is going to help me. Like, just find someone that you have a good rapport with, that you feel safe with and comfortable with. Obviously, that hopefully has some good referrals as well, but someone
Yeah.
that can help you out and just kind of hold some space for
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Thank you. Where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks. So the best place is probably through my website. I'm kind of taking a bit of a social media hiatus at the moment, but it's
Nice.
mindfulcounselingdenver.com. And over there, I have all kinds of blogs. I also have a YouTube channel, which is Emma Kobil LLC as well, I think. I think that's what it is. But yes, Mindful Counseling Denver. All my YouTube videos are over on that website as well. So you can see all those
Cool.
over there. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. This was such a great conversation. I think it's going to be just like any time that we can sit down as women and kind of acknowledge and talk about these things, I think is really healing
Mhm.
for our
I
society
agree.
and
Yeah,
our
we need to have
community.
a space to talk
Yeah.
about this stuff. Like
Yeah.
it's something so much of us, I think we move through life like
Hmm.
our, internalizing a lot. And we have to do that in order to get by in society and survive, it might feel like, but
Yeah.
there are these, spaces and opportunities to connect. And I think they're so important. So yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
having me. And this is a great conversation.
Yeah. For those of you listening, if you like what you heard, please follow, subscribe, do all the things to support our podcast so that we can hopefully reach more people and share this beautiful message with more women that I think would benefit from hearing it. So tune in weekly. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I will see you all soon.